She hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. Not to her mother, not to her teachers, only to a dog. A dog who once served beside her fallen father. When the government decided to auction him off, she brought her piggy bank. But what happened next in that crowded town hall stunned the entire town and exposed a truth far darker than anyone expected. This is the story of Juniper and Bruno, the last bond of Cedar Hollow. Cedar Hollow was cloaked in the thin gray veil of early spring. The sky hung low over the quiet Montana town, its cloud-thick ceiling threatening a slow drizzle that never quite came. Snow still lingered in patches where the sun hadn't yet dared to touch, and the scent of melting ice mingled with the earthy musk of thawing ground. The main street buzzed quietly more than usual, as families and old-timers shuffled toward the Silverleaf Community Hall, drawn not by curiosity but by something heavier. A sense of closing. A goodbye. Inside the hall, the walls breathed with warmth and whispers. The wooden floors creaked beneath folding chairs, filled with townsfolk wrapped in coats and flannel. On stage near the edge where the grain of the old pine boards grew faint, sat a German shepherd named Bruno, calm, motionless, but unmistakably alert. His body was massive, yet poised a blend of working muscle and trained restraint. At 7 years old, Bruno had the hardened bearing of experience. His black and tan fur was speckled slightly at the muzzle, and his amber eyes scanned the hall with the steady patience of a veteran. His ears twitched at every creak, his tail lay still. Only those who knew him best would notice the flicker in his gaze, a quiet unease masked under obedience. Bruno had once been the partner of Deputy Callum Whitlow, a name that still lingered in Cedar Hollow like the echo of a song. Callum had been killed in the line of duty 2 years earlier during a late-night narcotics raid near the edge of Bitterroot Ridge. He left behind his wife and a daughter, just a child. Then, the town mourned. And Bruno, he changed. His deployment was quietly reduced, his service hours cut, and eventually the decision was made to retire him. Not to a family, not to his partner's home, but to the auction block standard procedure, they said. At the far end of the fourth row, curled inward like a question mark, sat Juniper Whitlow, known simply as June, 8 years old. Slender, pale, and small for her age. Her blonde hair had been combed into 2 loose braids, but strands had already come undone by the time she entered the hall. She wore a faded yellow coat with sleeves too long and mismatched gloves, one navy, one gray. In her lap rested a ceramic piggy bank in the shape of a hedgehog, scuffed and chipped, its coin slot patched with tape. She held it tightly with both hands, thumbs rubbing circles along its surface. June hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 years. Not to her teachers, not to her classmates, not even to her mother. Only Bruno. The silence had settled on her like winter frost, still silent and hard to break. People in town said she was grieving in her own way, that she'd come around. Others whispered she was stuck in it. But none of them had seen her in the barn behind their old house, whispering softly into Bruno's fur, where only he could hear her voice. Next to her sat Meredith Whitlow, mid-30s, with the weathered look of someone who used to be joyful. Her dark auburn hair was tied back in a loose bun, her eyes sharp, despite the soft lines of fatigue. She wore a simple wool coat and kept one arm behind June's shoulders, not touching, but close enough to catch her. If she drifted, Meredith hadn't wanted to come. She hated the idea of putting a price on loyalty, of turning Bruno into something transactional. But June had insisted not with words, but with the way she had stood by the door that morning, piggy bank in hand, eyes clear with the kind of quiet defiance only grief can forge. The stage creaked as Dale Munson, the auctioneer, stepped forward. He was a portly man with a thinning comb-over suspenders, stretched taut across a checkered shirt. Dale had called auctions in Cedar Hollow for 20 years, but even he seemed subdued as he tapped the gavel against the podium. Next up, he announced voice low but carrying retired K-9 unit. Bruno, 7 years of service, narcotics detection and search and rescue. Starting bid, $2,500. The room held its breath. Somewhere near the front, a man raised a paddle and the bidding began. June didn't watch the numbers. She was watching Bruno. He was sitting as trained, but his head turned slightly toward her ears, angling. For a heartbeat, his gaze met hers, and it held, the kind of look that didn't need words, the kind of look that said, "I remember," and more importantly, "I'm still yours." She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tightening around the piggy bank. The coins inside rattled softly. It was every cent she had saved since her father's funeral. Birthday, money tooth fairy quarters. Crumpled dollar bills slipped quietly from kind neighbors who said, "For something special someday." This was the day the bidding climbed, $3,500, $5,200. Someone in a dark blue suit raised his paddle without even looking up. Whispers swelled behind him. June's heart thudded so loud it echoed in her ears. Bruno hadn't moved, but his tail had thumped once quiet. Slow. She stood. Gasps fluttered through the room like startled birds. A child wasn't supposed to stand in the middle of an auction, but June did. She clutched the piggy bank in both hands and stepped slowly into the aisle. Her eyes locked on the stage. People parted for her like a wave. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her steps said everything. Bruno rose to his feet, not in disobedience but in recognition. Someone behind her murmured, "That's his girl, the deputy's daughter." The auctioneer hesitated. He looked at Sheriff Evans, who stood near the exit, arms folded, expression unreadable. Meredith didn't move. She just watched her daughter move forward, head high, silence radiating louder than any protest. At the foot of the stage, June stopped. She raised the piggy bank as if presenting an offering. Bruno took a step forward. Officer Reynolds, a lean man in his 30s with salt and pepper hair and a quiet demeanor, gently tugged the leash. But Bruno resisted. Not aggressively, just firmly. His gaze never left June. And then, with an almost imperceptible shift, he sat again, this time facing her. The room was still. June lowered the piggy bank and returned to her seat. No one bid for a long while after. The hush in the hall held like breath trapped beneath ice. Dale Munson's gavel hovered midair, the last bid still hanging unanswered, $12,500, from a stranger no one had expected. For a moment, even the seasoned auctioneer blinked in confusion, as if unsure whether what had happened was real. The bidder stood near the back of the room just beside the wall, where light from the high windows painted slow stripes across the floor. Silas Delaney was a tall man in his early 60s with a lean frame, hardened by decades of outdoor labor. His face was long, deeply lined by sun and solitude, with steel-gray eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. A salt and pepper beard, trimmed just enough to appear unkempt, with intent framed his mouth, which was set in a line that had long since forgotten how to smile. He wore a waxed canvas coat the color of dried earth, a woolen scarf wound tightly around his neck, and a felt hat that he tipped only after nodding to Dale. He looked like a man who belonged in the wild, like he'd stepped down from a mountain trail only to bid on a ghost. People whispered his name. Silas Delaney owned the Bramble Ridge Ranch, 5 miles outside of town, a spread of windswept land where horses were raised and fences were always repaired by his own hand. He was known more by reputation than presence. Most said he hadn't set foot in Cedar Hollow proper in over 2 years. Some claimed he'd gone half mad after the death of his younger sister, who'd worked as a chemical technician at a major pharmaceutical firm, and died under strange circumstances. No one knew details. Silas never spoke of it. from her place in the fourth row. June looked back. She didn't recognize him, but something in his posture, stoic but not cold, seemed to quiet the pounding in her chest. Bruno, however, didn't wait. The leash slipped through Officer Reynolds' fingers like silk, and the dog leapt from the stage with startling agility for his age. He landed on all fours, head low, ears back, not in fear but in focus. He bounded toward June, threading through the aisle as if the people were ghosts. Gasps rose, but no one tried to stop him. Bruno reached her in 4 long strides and pressed his body into her side, his chest rising and falling fast. June didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The piggy bank still in her lap fell and rolled against the floorboards, unbroken this time. Bruno sat rigid but calm, a low huff of breath escaping his nose as he rested his chin lightly on her shoulder. Sheriff Robert Evans, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His presence alone drew a line through the room, broad-shouldered with a thinning silver crew cut and a permanent furrow between his brows. Evans had served longer than most of the deputies in town had been alive. He was not unkind, but he believed in rules like others believed in God. We'll need to hold final placement until the paperwork clears. He said, voice low but firm, I'm not contesting the rules, Sheriff Silas called from the back, his tone like gravel smoothed by time. I'm just making sure she doesn't lose him tonight. Evans studied the man, then nodded once slow. As the crowd began to shift and chairs scraped back against the wood, Bradley Knox stepped into view. Bradley was Meredith's fiancé, a clean-cut man in his early 40s with sandy blonde hair, always neatly combed, and pressed khakis that somehow never wrinkled. He worked as a logistics manager at a trucking depot outside of town, and had the kind of smile that was more practiced than heartfelt. He placed a hand on Meredith's shoulder. Well, he said quietly, I guess that's that. Meredith didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on her daughter and Bruno, both wrapped around each other like storm-swept trees, clinging to one another. Later that evening, long after the auction ended, Silas waited outside by the hitching post, the brim of his hat low against the drizzle that had finally begun to fall. Meredith approached with a cautious stride. June and Bruno just behind her. She kept one hand on the dog's collar, though Bruno clearly wasn't going anywhere without the girl. Silas looked up as they arrived, eyes unreadable. You know her? Meredith asked, cutting straight to the point. No, Silas replied simply, but I knew her father. Meredith tilted her head, brow tight. How? Silas took a slow breath. Callum was helping my sister. She worked for Rathmore Industries. She sent him documents, things that didn't look right, chemical discrepancies, unreported compounds. She thought she was being watched. Then she died in a fire they called accidental equipment failure. He said he was going to push it further, take it up with state-level investigators. Meredith's lips parted slightly. He never told me that. Probably didn't want to endanger you, Silas said, and for a moment his eyes softened, or her. He nodded toward June, who stood quietly beside Bruno, one hand wrapped tightly in the fur of his neck. I didn't come here to make a scene. Silas continued. I came to make sure that dog doesn't end up somewhere that'll muzzle the truth. Meredith looked away, the weight of her husband's secret pressing in like cold air. You believe Rathmore had something to do with Callum's death? I don't believe in coincidences, Silas said, and I believe Bruno knows more than we think. Bruno let out a small whine, as if in agreement. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen windows of the Bramble Ridge Ranch in soft amber lines, catching the edges of dust motes dancing through the air. The room was still silent, except for the ticking of an old clock perched on a shelf above the stove. Meredith Whitlow stood by the sink, her hands idle around a chipped ceramic mug filled with cold coffee. Her mind had wandered again, out into questions she didn't know how to ask, and answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Outside the window, she could see June in the field, trailing behind Bruno. The dog stayed close, matching the girl's pace, his ears twitching at every shift of wind, every sound that might have gone unnoticed by a human ear. He had become her shadow, and somehow Meredith thought her anchor. From the hallway came the sound of boots on floorboards. Silas Delaney, tall and weather-worn, stepped into the kitchen with a slow gait, as if movement cost him thoughts. He wore the same dark canvas coat from the day before, and his beard was a little more unkempt in the golden light. He paused, glanced at Meredith, and made for the coffee pot, which had long since gone lukewarm. As he poured, Meredith spoke quiet without turning. "You mentioned Rathmore yesterday." Silas stopped. The pause was brief but telling. He finished pouring, set the pot down with a soft clink. "Yeah," he said eventually. Meredith turned her gaze steady now. "That's the same company Callum was looking into, isn't it?" Silas leaned against the counter, cup in hand. "He didn't tell you." "He told me bits," she replied. "Something about corporate malpractice, but he never said names." Silas let out a breath. Not exasperated, just tired. Rathmore Industries. He confirmed big pharma player, headquartered out of Portland. They've got labs in 3 states and a distribution chain that reaches federal contracts, high-level quiet. "And your sister Meredith asked," Silas nodded slowly. "Rebecca." She was a chemical tech, smart, methodical. Too principled for the job, if I'm honest. She started noticing irregularities, substances logged under wrong names, chemicals ordered in quantities that didn't match the official research. One day, she left me a voicemail. Said she was scared. Said she'd found something she shouldn't have. Meredith swallowed. And then she was dead. 3 days later, he said flatly. Official report said lab equipment malfunctioned, gas leak. But the timing, it was too clean, too convenient. There was a long silence. From outside came the faint sound of June laughing, only a breath of it, but enough to break the air inside the room. Silas glanced toward the sound. His face unreadable. Callum contacted me not long after. Said he was looking into Rathmore too. He never gave me details, just that he thought Rebecca had been right. That something was being covered up. Meredith turned away, staring out the window again, and now Callum's gone, and she's gone. Silas nodded. Her voice was thinner when she spoke again. "So, why Bruno?" Silas looked at her now. Because Rebecca wasn't working on medicine for people. She was working on compounds tested on animals. Specifically, canine units. They were trying to modify behavior, suppress fear, increase compliance. It was never approved for field use, but he trailed off. But they tested it anyway. Meredith finished, her voice sharper. Now Silas nodded once, and Bruno was one of the dogs in that program. I don't know what he was exposed to, but I know this. He reacted to something Callum had started connecting dots. Bruno might be the last living evidence of what they did. Bruno barked once from the field. Meredith looked up. He was standing at alert beside June, his body positioned between her and the fence line where wind shifted the dry grass. His tail was stiff, his ears forward. "Then they'll come for him," she said quietly. Silas didn't reply. He didn't have to. Evening had fallen on Cedar Hollow, drawing long shadows through the trees that lined the edge of Bramble Ridge. The light in the ranch house glowed amber against the gathering dark. Meredith Whitlow stood in the small study off the main hallway, her fingers hovering above the touchpad of her laptop, her breath frozen in her chest. The email stared back at her. It was brief. Just 3 lines. From Graham, Rathmore, Rathie. Farm, Com. To Bradley, Knox Sigmail. Come Subject REK9, Bruno. Access Coordination. Appreciate your continued discretion. Data provided has helped confirm patterns. We'll proceed with the next step once the animal is secure. GR. Meredith's hand slowly lowered to the desk, trembling slightly. In the next room she could hear June's quiet hums as she played with Bruno on the living room rug. The dog's tail thudded gently against the floor in rhythm with her soft laughter. It was rare, fragile, like glass held in sunlight. She closed the laptop. Moments later, she found Bradley Knox on the front porch. He stood leaning against the wooden railing looking out toward the pasture, his coat zipped to the top and hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The porch light behind him threw sharp lines across his jaw. Clean-shaven trim, composed, always composed. "You lied to me," Meredith said, her voice calm but cutting. He turned startled. "What?" "You gave information about Bruno to Graham Rathmore." His face froze for half a second, then relaxed into something resembling practiced sincerity. "Meredith, I didn't give them anything dangerous. Just background behavior reports, observations. That's not your place," she said. He took a slow breath. They're trying to prevent a mistake. The dog, he's a reminder. Meredith, and not the good kind. June is stuck. She hasn't grown, hasn't spoken, hasn't moved forward since Callum died. She needs to heal. She is healing, Meredith said. In her own time, Bruno is part of that. Bradley shook his head. No, he's the wall that keeps her inside her grief. Meredith stepped closer, her voice lower now. You don't understand her. That dog isn't a wall. He's the last open door to her father. You take that away. She doesn't just lose a pet. Bradley, she loses what little of Callum she has left. Bradley looked away, jaw tight. I'm trying to give her a future. No, she said. You're trying to erase her past. The silence between them was thick. Far off, a nightbird cried out into the dark, breaking the tension only slightly. Bradley shifted his voice softer. I didn't mean to hurt her. Or you, but you did, Meredith replied. And I don't know if I can trust you after this. His shoulders slumped slightly, so that's it? She didn't answer. Behind them, inside the house, Bruno barked once alert. Protective. Meredith turned toward the sound instinctively. When she looked back, Bradley was already stepping down the porch steps, his figure dissolving into the shadowed path without another word. The Cedar Hollow Town Hall had never hosted such a tense gathering. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall, dust-streaked windows, illuminating rows of metal folding chairs, filled with townspeople, off-duty officers, and local reporters clutching notepads like shields. At the front of the room sat a long wooden table behind which the Community Placement Council presided 5 members, known more for their festival organizing than legal expertise, but today they held in their hands the fate of a single German shepherd, and everything he represented. Bruno lay at June Whitlow's feet, still and watchful. His thick black and tan coat freshly brushed, his eyes fixed on the council. His ears perked at every loud whisper and shuffle of feet, but he stayed beside June like a sentinel carved from living muscle. June, now dressed in a pale blue cardigan with a single missing button, sat small but straight-backed between her mother Meredith and Silas Delaney. Her fingers clutched Bruno's collar as if it were a lifeline. Across the room, seated with a team of lawyers, was Graham Rathmore, CEO of Rathmore Industries. He was a man in his early 50s with a pale, angular face, silver hair combed sharply back, and a voice honed by decades of boardrooms and press releases. He wore a 3-piece navy suit and a gold tie clip shaped like a dagger. Beside him, a woman in a slate-gray pantsuit scribbled furiously into a legal pad. Celeste Harmon led counsel for the pharmaceutical giant. Her brows were tight and her mouth thin, but she scanned the room with clinical precision, her voice measured when called upon. The chairwoman of the council, Irene Thatcher, a retired librarian with soft white curls and tired but honest eyes, called the hearing to order. Meredith glanced down at her daughter. "You okay?" she whispered. June nodded once. Her lips pressed together. Irene cleared her throat. This proceeding concerns the custody and placement of retired K-9 unit. Bruno, formerly paired with the late Deputy Callum Whitlow. We understand there are competing claims. On one hand, a private purchase made during the Silverleaf auction by Mr. Silas Delaney, and on the other, legal filings by Rathmore Industries claiming the animal was involved in proprietary research. We are here to determine what's in the best interest of the dog and the community. Celeste stood. Her voice was calm but sharpened with intent. Ladies and gentlemen, Rathmore Industries appreciates the Council's willingness to host this dialogue. However, let me be clear, Bruno was part of a federally funded behavioral trial. Data collected through his participation belongs to Rathmore. Transferring ownership without federal clearance would violate both confidentiality and liability standards. We are prepared to seek damages against the township if proper procedures are not followed. Murmurs broke through the crowd. Meredith stood, placing a hand gently on June's back. "Councilwoman Thatcher," she said, her voice strained but steady. "That dog was our family's. He served with my husband, died with him in the line of duty. He isn't Data. He's all my daughter has left." Celeste opened her mouth to object, but Irene raised a hand. "She may finish." Meredith took a breath. Bruno is the only one June talks to. Since the funeral, she hasn't spoken a single word until last night. She turned to her daughter June. The room held its breath. June shifted, standing slowly. Her shoes squeaked slightly on the polished wooden floor. She opened her mouth, and for a moment nothing came. Then quietly, "Please don't take him." The silence was immediate. Her voice was small, nearly trembling, but clear. It cracked halfway through, but no one missed the weight behind it. Her first words in nearly 3 years. Graham Rathmore leaned forward slightly, but his face remained unreadable. Councilwoman Thatcher blinked, visibly moved. Silas rose next, a folder tucked under one arm. His voice rumbled low and even. "I'd like to submit evidence," he said, stepping toward the table. "These are documents recovered from my sister's encrypted backup drive. Rebecca Delaney was a lead technician in Rathmore's K-9 compound trial. These pages detail a batch labeled Delta-4, not only unapproved but chemically unstable. There are notes here." He tapped the folder showing the trial continued after the program was officially shut down, including exposure records signed by Callum Whitlow. Gasps and scattered mutterings spread like fire. Celeste stood instantly. "These documents were obtained illegally. They are not admissible under any. They're not for court." Silas said, his voice steady. "They're for truth." Irene glanced down at the folder, then at her fellow council members. "We will review them during deliberation." Graham Rathmore stood now. His tone was colder than his attorney's. "Let me be perfectly clear. If that dog is not surrendered within 72 hours, I will pursue legal action against this council, this town, and the parties in possession of our property. Emotional stories do not override legal precedent." Councilman Don Briggs, a retired forest ranger with a craggy face and slow gait, finally spoke. "I served alongside Deputy Whitlow," he said gruffly. "That dog saved lives in this town. I don't much care what some lab paper says. He belongs with the people he protected." "We appreciate your sentiment," Celeste said quickly. "But sit down," Irene said firmly. Then she turned back to the others. "We'll recess for 20 minutes and return with our decision." June sat quietly, her hand still resting on Bruno's head. Meredith leaned over and kissed her temple. In the quiet that followed, Silas whispered. "You did good, kid." The wind sharpened over Cedar Hollow as twilight dropped into the town like a stone in a well. At the edge of the hills beyond Bramble Ridge, the shadows stretched long, brushing the porch steps of an old cabin hidden deep beneath a canopy of spruce and pine. Its tin roof bore the rust of seasons endured, and ivy curled up one side like creeping memory. Inside, a single oil lamp burned on the windowsill, its flickering glow illuminating stacks of old papers and medical folders. Eliza Kincaid stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped green mug. She was in her mid-40s with wiry auburn hair pinned back in a loose twist. Her figure was lean, and tall shoulders, slightly hunched from years of working in labs and keeping her head down. Her eyes, though a pale, piercing blue, burned with the weight of withheld truth. She wore an oversized knit cardigan, hand-mended at the elbows, and corduroy pants stained at the knees. Her voice, when it came, was low but unwavering. "I told them no," she said, turning to face Silas and Meredith, who sat at her small dining table. "I told Rathmore I wouldn't sign the non-disclosure. They offered me money, threatened to blacklist me from every biotech company in Oregon." Then came the warning. Meredith leaned forward. "What kind of warning?" Eliza lowered herself into the seat across from them. 2 weeks later, Micah collapsed during gym class seizures, elevated blood pressure. He was 8. No prior medical issues. They claimed it was coincidence. Her voice caught slightly, but I knew he'd been exposed to something. Silas narrowed his eyes. "Was it Delta 4? Eliza nodded slowly. Micah was part of a pilot group. The compound was supposed to improve cognitive focus, help children with sensory disorders adapt in high-stress environments. But it wasn't ready, too unstable. Callum Whitlow found out through one of the test administrators and contacted me directly. She rose, walked over to a locked cabinet, and withdrew a thin folder marked Confidential, Internal Trial. L4 Delta. Inside were handwritten notes, graphs, and printed email chains. Eliza set it down on the table with quiet finality. He was trying to build a case, said he had contacts in state-level oversight. He warned me to get out to hide the originals somewhere safe. A week after our last call, he was killed. Silas turned one of the pages. He never told me this. He said the fewer people who knew the full picture, the safer we'd be. I only kept this because I owed him. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea again. He saved Micah. Got him emergency access to detox treatments through a friend at the CDC. He didn't just risk his badge, he risked everything. Meredith stared at the papers, a tremble in her voice. Why now? Why come forward? Now. Eliza looked toward the single-framed photo on the wall, her and a boy with dark curls and crooked teeth, arms flung around each other in a sunlit backyard. Because I saw the hearing on the news, saw June's face. And Bruno. I know that dog. He was there the day Callum pulled us out of a blocked tunnel after the lab fire. He stayed with Micah while the medics worked. He didn't move an inch. She turned to Meredith, voice trembling now. That girl is carrying the weight I've spent 10 years burying. And I won't let Rathmore erase her the way they erased Callum. Silas stood slowly. You're willing to testify? Eliza nodded, on record. Documents, dates, testimony. Whatever you need. Meredith stood too, her eyes glassy. Thank you. As they prepared to leave, Micah entered from a side room. Now 15, he was tall and lanky, with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and a flannel shirt that hung slightly loose on his frame. He glanced curiously at the strangers, then moved toward Eliza, who put a hand on his shoulder. Micah, she said softly, this is Silas and Meredith. They were friends of Callum. Micah smiled politely and nodded. He's the one who saved us, right? Meredith smiled gently. Yes, he was. Micah's expression turned more serious. Then it's good you're still fighting. Back in the truck driving down the old dirt road toward town, Meredith sat in silence as Silas kept one hand on the wheel and one on the envelope of documents resting between them. "She's brave," Meredith said at last. "She's broken," Silas replied, "but brave too." And this, Meredith tapped the envelope. "This could change everything. If they let it," he muttered. "We still have a fight ahead." From the bed of the truck, Bruno's head lifted at the word, fight. His ears twitched alert. He let out a low, measured breath and rested his head once more. The morning broke cold over Cedar Hollow with a hard frost silvering every rooftop and blade of grass. A thin layer of mist clung to the streets as townsfolk filed slowly into the town hall, their breath visible in the air, their voices hushed with anticipation. The building, usually reserved for garden club meetings and high school debates, now buzzed with tension. The old wooden sign above the entrance read, "Public Hearing. Final decision regarding K9 Bruno." Inside, folding chairs lined the room, wall to wall. The council table stood as before its 5 members already seated and whispering among themselves. Councilwoman Irene Thatcher sat in the middle, calm but visibly tired, her knitting needles missing for once, replaced by a thick folder of legal memos. Meredith Whitlow stood near the front with June, who clutched Bruno's leash in one hand and her mother's coat with the other. June wore her pale green dress and boots still slightly dusty from the day before. Bruno sat beside her tail, still eyes steady, body relaxed but alert. Every inch the trained K9 he once was. Silas Delaney stood beside them, dressed in a clean-pressed shirt and jacket he hadn't worn in years. His face bore the gravity of someone prepared to speak truth regardless of cost. Then the doors opened again and all turned. Eliza Kincaid entered the hall. Her hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she wore a charcoal gray blazer over a soft blouse, the first real makeup anyone had seen on her in a decade. Her son, Micah, walked beside her, hands in the pockets of his jacket posture. Stiff. Eliza carried a locked document case in her arms, her face unreadable but composed. A murmur swept the room. Most recognized her name, though few had seen her since the incident at the lab that nearly cost her and her son their lives. Councilwoman Thatcher raised her voice, clearing the room. "This hearing is now in session. The matter before us is the placement of retired K9. Bruno, contested by Rathmore Industries and community residents. Before we proceed, we've been informed there is new testimony and evidence." Silas stepped forward. "We'd like to call Eliza Kincaid to speak. Celeste Harmon, Rathmore's legal representative." Immediately stood counsel. "We were not informed of this testimony. We request a continuance." Thatcher cut her off. "The council has the discretion to hear last-minute evidence in matters of community concern. Ms. Kincaid, you may proceed." Eliza stepped up to the podium. She opened the document case and removed a sealed envelope and a stack of papers, then placed a small photo of Micah, aged 8, lying unconscious in a hospital bed facing the council. "My name is Eliza Kincaid," she began. "I was a senior chemical technician at Rathmore Industries. For 6 years I worked directly on the Delta-4 compound, a substance never approved by the FDA, never subjected to open peer review, and still tested on live subjects, including military and law enforcement animals." She looked toward Bruno. "That dog," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "was one of them." Gasps rippled through the room. "I left Rathmore after my son, then 8, collapsed from neurological damage caused by exposure to early-stage Delta-4. The company told me to sign non-disclosure agreements. Threatened me. My son nearly died. It was Deputy Callum Whitlow who helped us disappear and got Micah emergency treatment. And now, I owe it to him to speak." She handed the documents to the clerk who passed them to the council. charts, lab reports, internal memos. Each page was stamped. Confidential. Celeste stood fuming. These documents were stolen. Eliza turned to her. They were my files. You may have taken my job, but you don't own my truth. A silence heavier than argument filled the hall. Silas then stepped forward with calm authority. And if the council needs more than words, I've set up a trust, called Whitlow's Hope. It'll provide funding oversight and a board-certified behavioral trainer to help Bruno transition into a certified community therapy dog. We'll make him available for school senior centers and trauma patients under supervision. This dog won't just stay in June's care, he'll serve the entire town. The crowd stirred again, this time with surprise and admiration. Councilman Don Briggs cleared his throat. So, you're saying this dog will work for the town? Voluntarily, Silas said. And safely. With June as his companion, Irene turned toward June, who was still standing quietly. June, she said gently, do you want to say anything? June stepped forward. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. He's not just my dog, he was my dad's. He remembers him, and he remembers us. Please don't take him away. A long pause. Then Councilwoman Thatcher turned to the other council members. Quiet words were exchanged. A gavel struck wood. In light of today's testimony, the community's support, and the new proposal offered by Mr. Delaney Irene began this council rules in favor of placing Bruno permanently in the care of June Whitlow and her mother Meredith. Further, the council recognizes the establishment of the Whitlow's Hope Trust and supports the designation of Bruno as a licensed community therapy animal under local oversight. Applause erupted. Someone in the back shouted, "Yes." A few others wept. Bruno barked once, sharp and triumphant. June dropped to her knees and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. Meredith hugged her daughter tightly, then looked at Eliza, mouthing, "Thank you," across the crowd. Graham Rathmore rose silent and seething, his expression tight. Celeste gathered the files quickly, and the two exited the hall without a word. Outside, the bells of the town's old chapel rang noon. The wind rolled softly through Cedar Hollow, no longer biting or brittle, but warm and threaded with the scent of blooming clover and old pine. The fields stretched green and golden under the afternoon sun, and just past the crest of Bramble Ridge, the old Delaney Ranch had been transformed. Gone were the sagging fences, and quiet decay in their place stood a new wooden sign carved in careful hand-lettered script. Bruno's Haven, Animal-Assisted Therapy and Community Healing Center. 1 year had passed. The barn, once filled with dust and silence, now echoed with the occasional bark, the laughter of children, and the gentle cadence of healing. Inside, hay had been replaced with cushioned floors and colorful murals. Therapy rooms were painted with calming blues and soft yellows, while wide windows overlooked the hills beyond. Staff wore shirts printed with a simple logo, a shepherd dog's silhouette standing beside a child beneath a rising sun. At the heart of it all sat June Whitlow. Now 9 years old, June had grown taller, her cheeks fuller, her voice no longer a fragile echo but a steady current. Her dark brown hair was tied in a loose braid, and a lanyard hung proudly from her neck that read, "Youth Advocate, Bruno's Haven." She was seated on the wide wooden swing that hung from the porch beam of the new lodge, her legs tucked beneath her, and her hand gently resting on Bruno's back. Bruno, now approaching 10, still bore the noble frame of a K9, though his muzzle had grown grayer and his steps a touch slower. But his ears, those proud chiseled German shepherd ears, remained ever alert. He lay beside June, his body pressed close tail, flicking softly with each breath she took. Around them the porch held potted herbs, hand-painted flower pots from local school kids, and a memory plaque that read, "In honor of Deputy Callum Whitlow, protector, father, friend, Inside the center buzzed with visitors. Meredith Whitlow now worked as the community liaison at the Haven, her voice calm but firm, her presence grounding. She wore simple slacks and a blue blouse, and her expression, once marked by grief, was now tempered with resolve. She guided a small group of new parents through the intake process, explaining how therapy dogs were paired with children recovering from trauma loss or anxiety. Silas Delaney, who once lived like a ghost in the woods, now served as the director of outreach. Today, he was on the back lawn helping build a new shaded enclosure for older dogs. His sleeves were rolled, his hands calloused again, but this time by choice, not burden. He moved with quiet energy, pausing now and then to wave at familiar faces or answer questions from the local high school volunteers. Even Micah Kincaid, now 16, was part of the staff helping clean kennels and walk the dogs. He'd grown into a thoughtful, lanky teen with a dry wit and a gift for calming anxious animals. His mother, Eliza, visited weekly, serving as a consultant and occasionally giving seminars on medical ethics. The town had rallied behind the Haven. Donations from local families, fundraising events organized by schoolchildren, and even grants from neighboring counties had made it not just a local treasure but a symbol of collective healing. "Can I pet him?" June looked up. A boy stood before her, maybe 7, wearing a red cap and a nervous smile. His mother stood a few paces behind, arms crossed, but hopeful. June smiled and nodded. "Just ask him first. Say his name softly." The boy knelt beside Bruno. "Hi, Bruno," he said shyly. Bruno lifted his head, sniffed, then let out a soft huff and wagged his tail. The boy giggled, reaching out with hesitant fingers, then relaxed as Bruno pressed his head into the boy's palm. June watched them quietly, her hand still on Bruno's back. A moment later, Meredith stepped onto the porch, brushing her hands on her jeans. She approached the swing, brushing a stray hair from June's forehead. "You ready for your talk?" she asked. June hesitated. "Will there be a microphone?" Meredith laughed, "just a small one." June groaned playfully but stood. "Okay, but only because Bruno says it's important." Down by the main lodge, a modest stage had been set up for the Haven's 1-year anniversary. Folding chairs lined the yard filled with neighbors, local officials, and families whose lives had been touched by the center. A large banner read, "Bruno's Haven, 1 year of healing." Councilwoman Irene Thatcher was seated in the front row, her white curls more pronounced, a camera hanging from her neck. She waved as June approached the podium, Bruno walking beside her. June stepped up, heart-thumping but voice strong. "Hi," she began. "I'm June. This is Bruno." The audience chuckled softly. "A year ago, I didn't talk. I didn't feel safe. My dad was gone. My best friend was going to be taken away. But Bruno stayed, and when he stayed, I stayed." She looked down at him. Bruno wagged his tail, once slow and sure. "My mom says healing takes time. Silas says it takes courage. I think it takes both. And I think Bruno teaches us how to do both." There was silence, and then applause, gentle, then rising. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the guests trickled home, June returned to the porch swing. Bruno climbed up beside her, his body warm against the fading chill. The sky turned gold and purple, washing the world in the kind of light that made everything seem softer. She leaned her head against him. "We did it," she whispered. He let out a long breath, content. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with lightning or thunder, but with fur, quiet loyalty, and the steady beat of a heart that never leaves our side. Bruno wasn't just a dog. He was a messenger of healing, a bridge between silence and hope, between loss and redemption. Through him, June found her voice again. Through him, a town remembered what it meant to protect the broken and honor the brave. In our everyday lives, we may feel like the pain is too deep or the past too heavy, but God often sends healing in the form we least expect. A friend, a second chance, a faithful companion with ears that listen when no one else does. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen below to stand with children like June and heroes like Bruno. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and guide you in your journey.